This episode is brought to you by the MJ family of companies. Whatever interests you in the cannabis community can be found at mj.com. Unique and original content updating you on the latest trends in marijuana legalization, businesses and executives that are disrupting the industry, along with recreational entertainment and the latest deals on the brands and products you love. Visit mj.com today. Welcome to the Pot Live Podcast. I'm your host, Lenny G, and I can't believe it. We've already broken through 100 episodes. We want to thank you, the listeners, thousands of you that have sent beautiful comments, beautiful notes to us. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy it. This next year, we're going to bring you the thought leaders, entertainers, trailblazers, CEOs of all the cannabis companies you want to hear from. People that are inventing new products, people that are bringing this cannabis industry to the mainstream. We are going to offer you education, value, and entertainment. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Welcome to another episode of the Pot Live Podcast. This is your host, Lenny G, and today our special guest is Mr. David Abernathy. He is the principal of the Arcview Consulting Group. Arcview is a vertically integrated investment firm servicing the cannabis industry. They are a trusted global leader for investors, companies, entrepreneurs, money managers, and the community as a whole. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Also, tell everybody a little bit before we get into Arcview and all the great things you're doing there. Tell us a little bit about who David is. What's your background? How'd you get into the industry?
Sure. So I've been in the cannabis industry for about 12 years now. Prior to getting into the industry, I worked for an engineering consulting firm. I worked for an investment bank, and I worked for a tech startup. And really kind of had a come to Jesus moment while I was working for both the investment bank and the tech startup. So I was working all day at the bank, going home and working all night on the tech startup, which, is something that was doable in my early 20s. But I realized after a while that I wasn't really happy doing that. I was sitting in my office one day, I had a beautiful office overlooking the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. It was a beautiful day outside, and we had just wrapped up the financing on a wind farm project and put through a $1.2 billion wire transfer for that project. And I realized that while they were paying me well, they weren't paying me well compared to the amount of money I was making for other people. And I really just wanted to go outside. I didn't like sitting literally under fluorescent lights, looking at the beautiful outside through a window. And I realized I had enough saved up that I could take a break from working for a little while. So I quit both of those jobs, gave my 2 weeks, and cashed in literally all of my investments, including retirement, with the goal of just taking a breather and not working. Turns out that was literally a couple months before the financial crisis, which was a fantastic time to sell all of my investments. I wish I could say that I saw that coming, but it just
you can take credit for it, David. Go ahead, take credit. That's right.
Sure. And my plan was to spend about 2 years not working. Of course, I ended up having way too much fun and spending way too much money. And about 6 months later, realized I should probably figure out where my next check was going to come from. And at that point, it was a couple months after the economy had just completely collapsed. So there were no more jobs. After a few months of sending my resume off into the ether, I started to do some consulting work for small and medium-sized businesses, some investment due diligence work for private investors, and really made a nice little happy life for myself doing that, working about 10 hours a week, not getting rich, but paying the bills and having a good time. And that's when I met a guy who actually moved in next door to me. He was a former hedge fund consultant from New York who had quit his job and come to California. And after about 2 or 3 months knowing him, he came to me and said, "I'd like to start a financial services company for the medical cannabis industry. Do you want to help?" And I said yes. And we started a company with the goal of lending money to dispensaries and cultivations in California. That was in 2009. And what we very quickly realized before we even started lending money was that while there certainly was a big need for capital, there was also a need for consulting services. So we built a consulting division that ended up being significantly bigger than the financial services side of the business, helping folks from mainstream industries who wanted to get involved in the cannabis industry, and also helping folks who had been involved in the unregulated cannabis industry become compliant with the medical rules in California at the time.
Well, that's it's funny. It's ironic. I also came from corporate world and just walked away, but not the same crash. You're talking about the '08 crash, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was in the middle of the '01 crash with 9/11 and everything in New York, and then kind of just walked away and became a serial entrepreneur for the last 17, 18 years. So it's similar yet different, but I feel you, man. I know what you went through, and I went through similar things myself. So that's pretty cool. So tell everyone, who does Arcview cater to? Is it startups? Is it established companies? Is it everything in between? Give us a little more insight into what the services Arcview offers.
Sure. So Arcview has become a bit of a juggernaut. I joined Arcview in 2013. I was the third employee there. And at the time, Arcview was an investor network. So Arcview gathered together private investors who were interested in investing in early stage cannabis businesses and found the businesses that were raising capital in the space. Brought those two groups together. So that was sort of the initial incarnation of Arcview. That investor network still exists today, but since then we've added quite a few other businesses. Shortly after I joined, Arcview acquired a company called Sea Change Research, which had published really the first report about the legal cannabis markets. So understanding what the regulatory dynamics were, what the size of the market was, how fast it was growing, and where. And we started publishing updated versions of that. So it was initially called the State of Legal Marijuana Markets. It's now called the State of Legal Cannabis Markets. And we published the 8th edition of that report last year. It's over the years become bigger and more robust and covers the size of state markets, state by state, the size of international markets, country by country, projections for their growth, regulatory dynamics. And then we also publish a whole host of other smaller reports looking at specific verticals or specific geographic regions. So that's all done under the Arcview Market Research brand. In addition to that, Arcview has a member-managed venture fund called Arcview Ventures, which is an investment fund placing capital in the space. Basically, investors buy into the fund and then vote on where to deploy the capital.
So it's almost like a member-managed, like you said, member-managed ETF, if you will, almost, right?
Yeah,
right.
Similar.
And do you invest in only private companies or public as well?
That's only private companies.
Yep.
And then we've got Arcview Capital, which is a FINRA licensed broker-dealer. So they help companies go out and raise money, help with M&A activity and things like that. And our newest business is Arcview Management Consulting. And we started doing consulting a couple of years ago when two really big companies, one from inside the cannabis industry and one from outside the cannabis industry, both came to us coincidentally around the same time and asked if we could help them with some pretty sizable consulting engagements. And we didn't really have plans to do consulting at the time, but we were pretty well positioned to be able to help them with what they were looking for. And so that went pretty well. And we kind of just left it at that. But we saw more and more interest in consulting services. So starting in March of 2020, we launched a consulting division within Arcview and started taking clients and doing consulting work. These clients are both inside and outside the cannabis industry. We look at medical and adult use cannabis. We look at CBD. We look at industrial hemp and environmental sustainability. helping companies understand supply chains, helping companies understand how to scale effectively, helping cannabis companies understand what the implications of federal legalization might be and how that could affect their business, both in terms of risks and opportunities. And in December of last year, just a few months ago, that consulting division became a separate entity, Arcview Management Consulting, which is operating under the umbrella of the Arcview Group. So Arcview essentially is an ecosystem to help companies and investors in and around the cannabis industry.
That's pretty cool, man. Especially, the way the industry has slowly become more and more mainstream, and maybe recently a little quicker as with the new administration, maybe will help accelerate that towards legalization over the next few years. Who knows? What's the difference in what you saw from 2013 when it was still taboo and the stigma was really attached to the industry to now as far as professionals becoming involved in the industry?
I mean, there have been just enormous changes. When I got involved in 2009, really it was two types of folks in the cannabis industry. It was the legacy folks who had been operating in the unregulated space, some of them for years or decades, who were figuring out how to become legal under the medical rules that existed at the time. And then there was a small group of professionals from all sorts of different backgrounds who started to want to figure out how to get involved in the cannabis space. And it was really adventurous folks in those early days that got involved. As it's become more mainstream over the years, more and more people have flowed into the industry. There are a lot of folks bringing really robust backgrounds from other industries that have served to really step the game up of the cannabis industry in a lot of ways. It's also, to some extent, had created some problems in the industry. I mean, we see some of the bad habits coming from other industries, coming from the mainstream finance industry, coming from other more established industries that have started creeping into the cannabis industry. So it's becoming significantly more white and significantly more male as folks come in from other industries, which just reflects the overall dominance of white men in most industries in this country.
Did you see it trending towards Big Pharma 2.0?
So cannabis is an interesting one in that there are a lot of really interesting comparisons to make with other industries, but there isn't one that works. So I do see a lot more happening in the pharma space with pharma companies working on things like Epidiolex and other pharmaceutical cannabis-derived products. But at the same time, we see sort of another branch of the industry evolving in a similar way to the alcohol industry, with a focus on consumer products that appeal to folks looking to de-stress and have a good time. We also see another branch, or a couple of branches, moving more towards the health and wellness side of the space. So this is especially evident on the CBD side, but even with medical and adult use cannabis, we see quite a few products that are really aimed at the health and wellness consumer and that are starting to look a lot like other health and wellness products. And then, of course, there's industrial hemp and its myriad applications, which start to get into mirroring industries as diverse as advanced carbon and building materials to textiles and all sorts of things. So yeah, I definitely see a movement towards more pharmaceutical cannabis, but not at the expense of these other branches of the industry that I think are going to continue to develop.
What do most companies that enlist your services, what do they need? Is it the ability to raise money since everything's still federally illegal? Is there a lot of money on the sidelines looking for these opportunities? Or is this, I hate to say smart money because, it's limiting again, like you just said earlier. I guess what I'm asking is there a lot of money on the sidelines waiting, or are they looking to jump into opportunities now to help a brand or platform or company that they like?
A little of both. There's definitely a lot of money that is not ready to come into the cannabis space just because it's still federally illegal in the United States. We saw some really interesting things happen over the past few years. Canada legalized cannabis at the federal level, which opened a really big door for capital to start flowing into the industry. And we saw just an unbelievable amount of capital, including institutional capital, come into the space right after Canada legalized. A company called Constellation Brands, which is a liquor company that owns Corona and a bunch of other beer and liquor brands that you know and love.
They have a huge stake in Canopy.
Yeah, they came in and they made initially about $193 million investment into Canopy Growth, which is a Canadian licensed producer. And that was by far the biggest single investment we had seen in the cannabis space. They followed that up with another $4 billion investment a few months later. And that really drove this big period of somewhat irrational exuberance around the cannabis space, with lots of money coming in, not a lot of focus on exactly where that money was going. A lot of big valuations in Canada. Canadian companies were raising more money than they could effectively deploy in Canada. Canada is not the biggest country in the world. And they started investing that money in other countries, including the United States. So we saw a big inflation of valuations of US companies. And that all started to die down a little bit in 2019 when there was a correction, and a lot of those valuations started to come back down to more reasonable territory. And that kind of put a chill on the investment market for a little while. And then, of course, that was followed 6 or 8 months later by COVID, which put a chill on all sorts of investment markets.
While ironically, the cannabis market itself thrived during COVID as an essential business, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we started to see as COVID sort of dragged on was there was this renewed interest with investors who had pulled their money out of other industries, looking at cannabis and saying, wow, maybe this is a safe place to put our money, considering that in many states, cannabis businesses were deemed essential businesses that were allowed to continue to operate even when many other businesses were forced to shut down. So that really kind of started another harder look at cannabis investments from some investors who hadn't maybe considered it before.
Yeah. So what's the process? Let's say I own a XYZ cannabis company and I come to Arcview. Do I start with a consulting relationship? If I'm looking for financing to scale my business, whatever type of business it may be, what's the process with Arcview? How does one go through to get to the finish line?
Sure. So it really depends on your needs. One of the great things about Arcview is that we have so many different areas of focus that we can help folks with depending on where they are and what their goals are. So if you're looking to raise capital and you've got a deal, maybe you've got a raise for several $1 million. It might be as simple as going straight to Arcview Capital and signing an agreement with them for them to help you raise that capital. It might be that you go to Arcview Ventures and pitch Arcview Ventures for an investment from them. We also have quite a few companies that come to the Arcview group and sponsor various things that we do. And it's a great way to get in front of our investor network, which really, right, we've got Arcview Capital that can help companies raise money. We've got Arcview Ventures that's placing capital. But then we've got hundreds and hundreds of high net worth accredited investors who are looking to place capital. So there are a lot of funding avenues. And then on the consulting side, a lot of the stuff that we do is not related to fundraising specifically. It's more about strategic growth or market entry, things like that. But we do often help companies that are raising capital if what they need is help putting together a strategic plan, help with pitch strategy, putting together pitch materials and pitch decks. We can act as sort of an outsourced chief strategy officer during the fundraise process and help companies answer questions that come up during due diligence from investors. So really when a company comes to us, the first thing that we do is take some time to figure out where the company is and where they're trying to go, and then we can direct them to the right part of Arcview to help them with their needs.
It's great. You have all the angles covered, which is pretty cool. And Arcview has definitely gained an amazing reputation over the years. So before we finish up, David, give us something just general in the industry. That one thing that concerns you about the cannabis industry and one thing that excites you.
Sure. So I think the thing that has been taking a lot of my mental energy lately that's concerning is what companies are going to do after federal legalization. So we have consulting services specifically designed to essentially provide a SWOT analysis for companies with respect to federal legalization, helping them understand what the most likely legalization scenarios are and what the potential threats and opportunities are that come along with those scenarios. And we found that companies are starting to think about this, but not enough companies are thinking about this. For years and years, since the advent of legal cannabis, one of the biggest market drivers has been regulatory shift. This is the biggest driver of growth in the cannabis industry. It is the biggest driver of headaches for cannabis companies. It is the biggest reason that cannabis companies fail. And federal legalization represents one of the biggest shifts in regulatory landscape that the cannabis industry is likely to see. And companies really need to understand whether they are positioned to thrive or fail when legalization comes around. A lot of businesses will fail, just flat out will not have a place post federal legalization. Many will be acquired and many will thrive in ways that were not possible prior to federal legalization. And this is true, by the way, not just of sort of licensed cannabis businesses, but also ancillary companies. So easy example would be if you're a fintech company that offers cashless payment services for cannabis companies, maybe even prior to full federal legalization, if something like safe banking passes, once cannabis companies have easy access to banking, easy access to merchant services, unless you've got a really compelling value add or you've generated a ton of traction and loyalty, it's unclear what a company like that will have.
I always thought that because there were so many companies came out as a short-term fix until legalization, but obviously legalization is going to happen at some point. The toothpaste is out of the tube. It's not going back in, right?
Yeah.
So what are they doing? That's what I've always wondered. There's so many of them that are out there, and I'm like, there's no long-term sustainable model for them.
Some of them do have a potential long-term sustainable model if they've bundled their sort of payment services with other services that are extremely helpful to cannabis businesses. So really, it's about positioning yourself and understanding that sort of the need for that specific cashless transaction service might have a limited shelf life. On the licensed business side, right, if you're a licensed cultivation that's growing cannabis in someplace like Maine, if federal legalization occurs and if it includes the ability to ship cannabis across state lines, which it may or may not, especially in the early days, but if it does, it's unclear whether a company in Maine is going to have a viable business growing cannabis in a place with very little sunlight and a high cost of production versus just importing cannabis.
Exactly.
That's my big concern, is that companies aren't really taking federal legalization seriously enough, both from a risks perspective, but also an opportunities perspective. There are cannabis companies that are going to create the kind of generational wealth that is only possible with a major shift in either technology or regulation, like the one that's going to occur with federal legalization. And so understanding where those opportunities are and how to position yourself to get them is important. So maybe that's the exciting part as well, is federal legalization.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. You morphed right into the exciting part. There you go.
Yeah. I've been fighting for legalization since I joined the industry in 2009. And one of the things you have to get used to when you're looking at drug policy and cannabis policy in particular is the amount of irrational ideas that exist around current drug prohibition and cannabis prohibition and the damage that those ideas do to our society. It's really hard to overstate the amount of devastation that the war on drugs has caused to our communities, specifically our Black and Brown communities in this country, but communities in general. And that continues to be a big problem. And people are losing their lives, people are losing their livelihoods, people are losing their freedom over a plant that should be legal, that's significantly safer than many of the things we do and consume in our society. And again, there's a really big opportunity for folks that are well positioned, and it won't just be big businesses that thrive post federal legalization. There will absolutely be big businesses that get involved and that thrive, but there will be space for small businesses as long as they are not excluded by regulations. So one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing is looking at other industries and drawing comparisons as we model the cannabis industry. And in non-durable goods markets, any sort of consumable goods, every single non-durable goods market that has a culture of connoisseurship shares some really interesting features. One of those is huge variation in pricing. So wine is a great example. You can get a $2 bottle of wine or a $20,000 bottle of wine or anything in between.
And quite often they taste the same.
And quite often they taste the same, yeah. And you can buy wine from a large multinational that produces millions of cases a year, or from a local vineyard that produces hundreds or thousands of cases a year. And there's space in the market for them to coexist. Chocolate and beer are interesting examples because for a long time in the 80s and 90s, there was no culture of connoisseurship to speak of around those product categories. And it was entirely dominated by big, large multinational companies. But as the culture of connoisseurship reemerged around chocolate and beer, we saw an explosion of microbreweries and local chocolatiers. You can now get a $30 bar of organic stone ground fair trade chocolate, and you can get a $15 bottle of locally brewed beer. And there's space in the market for the large and small producers. Smoked tobacco is another really interesting one because with cigarettes, there isn't a culture of connoisseurship. No one's like joining cigarette clubs and reading cigarette magazine about the pros and cons of Marlboros versus Camels. So you walk into a store, you have 50 choices, but they're all made by a few big multinationals and they're all the same price, plus or minus a dollar or two. But when you move over to the cigar space, there is that culture of connoisseurship. And again, we see the same features emerge. Big companies, small companies, you can get a really expensive cigar, a really cheap cigar. So we fully expect that the cannabis space will have space for these smaller craft, high quality brands, but brands really need to understand what that space is going to look like and how to position themselves to thrive as the market matures.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how post-legalization, how that landscape changes as far as the ability to market to the targeted consumer, whether it is just a mainstream consumer that, wants to buy a Budweiser, or somebody that wants to buy the, I don't know, whatever the high-end beer is of cannabis, right? It'll be interesting to see how they do that when marketing is more mainstream and legal.
Yeah, marketing is an interesting one because a lot of innovation has been necessary in the cannabis space because of the limitations on many forms of marketing that most industries take for granted. So we've seen a lot of really creative marketing strategies. We're not marketing consultants, but we work closely with marketing consultants and really help to bring an understanding of the data and the space into marketing strategy so that brands can take advantage of a deeper understanding of consumer behavior and preferences. There are quite a few firms capturing some really good data about consumer purchasing patterns, consumer desires, consumer archetyping, and we work with that data and with marketing firms to really develop strategies that allow cannabis companies to target their customers and to design products that are going to appeal to their customers in ways that other industries kind of take for granted, but that's still more difficult in the cannabis space.
Well, David, thank you so much for being our guest today. Can you tell everyone how they can find out more about Arcview and or get in touch with your team?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can visit us at arcviewgroup.com or at arcviewconsulting.com. And there are a variety of ways to get in touch there. Also, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and looking forward to meeting some new folks and seeing if there are ways that Arcview can help.
Excellent. Thank you again. David Abernathy, principal of Arcview Consulting. Thanks for being our guest. And we will see everyone next time on the Pot Live podcast. Looking for the best deals on all of your favorite CBD products? Check out the #1 rated online shop at cbddeals.net to find dozens of brands offering amazing deals for your wellness needs.